everybody a I want to wish everybody a Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, Happy Hanukkah, happy and Merry Holidays to everybody. I want to thank Natalie and Dave for their tremendous work in getting this program together. So again, I don't know if you heard me from the beginning. I am Scott Fairgrave, President of Nassau County Historical Society. We're hoping to have our meetings in person starting next year in February. We're working on that now. We're also trying to work on getting a museum for the society. And that's, a lot of people are working on that. And hopefully next year we'll have a major announcement on that, but that waits to be seen. So if you got notification, that we're recording this meeting, and we'll be recording other remarks made by myself and our speakers reviewing on a website later by those who missed the meeting. We would like to know how you heard about this meeting. So I'll ask you to select items from the poll we're putting up on your screen and please submit it. Okay. So finally, when you log off from the webinar, we'll ask you to take a brief survey asking for your anonymous review of today's meeting. If your input is welcome, and it only takes a couple of seconds to complete. If you have a question, use the question and answer button, and we'll answer the questions at the end of the talk. And I'd like to introduce Natalie Naylor, past president, to say a few words, and she's responsible for arranging this wonderful program. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. And I too am happy to welcome everyone. This is our 6th program this year on Long Island history. Our website has information about our past programs, including recordings of some of our virtual programs that would be on the calendar page. And I'm very pleased to announce that our next program is going to be on the renowned musician Louis Sachmo Armstrong, who lived in Corona, Queens for the last 3 decades of his life. His home is now a museum, and its director of research collections will be our speaker. And we hope that that will be in person on Sunday, February 5th, but the date has not yet been confirmed. We welcome new members. You can join by going to our website, NassauCountyHistoricalSociety.org, and that's the place where you can also make a donation online, NassauCountyHistoricalSociety.org. I'm also proud to announce that our journal, annual journal, which I edit with Dr. Paul Van Wy, was mailed to our members last week. I received my copy in the mail on Saturday. It has an article commemorating the 50th anniversary of Old Bethpage Village restoration and the story of Quaco, who was enslaved at Rock Hall. Our website has indexes to the hundreds of articles that have been in the 76 volumes of our journal. It is my pleasure now to introduce today's speaker, Claire Bellerjeau, who has researched the Townsend family of Oyster Bay and their slaves for more than 16 years. She was until recently the historian and director of education at Raynham Hall Museum, which is where the Townsend family lived. In her research, she has uncovered new information about Nathan Hale, discovered a new poem by the African-American poet Jupiter Hammond. And most pertinent for her presentation today, traced the fascinating story of Robert Townsend and enslaved Elizabeth, which she recounts in her recent book, The Espionage and Enslavement in the Revolution, the true story of Robert Townsend and Elizabeth. She will be telling us about their memorizing story this afternoon. And remember that you can put in the Q&A questions. We will address those at the end. So Claire, it's all yours.
Oh, thank you so much, Natalie. And thank you, David and Scott and everyone at the Nassau County Historical Society for having me here as your speaker. It's a real honor, and I'm so pleased to join with you today. Even if it's on Zoom, we're still together, and I still get to share this incredible story with you. So I'm going to start sharing my screen and start telling you more about this story. It's truly amazing. And let's start the actual slideshow. So I think everyone can see it now. Yes, thumbs up, Natalie. You can see it okay, right?
Yes.
Excellent. Yes, as Natalie said, it's been a long journey for me, 16 years of research to discover the life of Liz and to really tell completely the story of Robert Townsend as well. She's a real New Yorker. Her life is really that of someone who worked for years to gain her freedom. And so to tell her story, I really want to start at the beginning. So Liz was born into slavery around the year 1763. And she was enslaved her entire childhood and young adulthood by the Townsend family. And their home, the home she was born into, is now Raynham Hall Museum in Oyster Bay. The world that she was born into had legal slavery in every one of the 13 colonies. And the actual colony where she lived, New York, had more slavery in the year 1770 than any of the northern colonies, any colony north of Maryland. In fact, if you combined all the slavery in the New England colonies and added it all together, it was less than the slavery that took place in New York. Look down at the colony of Georgia on this graphic. And New York in 1770 had more slavery than Georgia. Now, the world she was born into had a terrible law that was established decades before she was born in 1730. This law mandated that every town in the colony of New York must have an official paid town slave whipper, or Negro whipper as they were called. Every one of our towns in Nassau County, if they existed at that time, had a whipping post and a paid slave whipper. The names that you can see on my slide are the names of the Oyster Bay town Negro whippers for the years that they recorded them. In fact, Oyster Bay had one in 1714, many years before that law went into action. And it wasn't just in those early records that we can find this sort of brutality and horrific treatment of enslaved people. This is a ledger book from a blacksmith named McCoon. It's a record from 1802 when Thomas Youngs, who has the famous Youngs Homestead and a Youngs Memorial Cemetery in Oyster Bay Cove, he was paying this blacksmith McCoon to shackle an enslaved person. It says, putting a band and bolt on a black, 3 wearing irons and 1 ring. Again, that was 1802. This same record has an even more horrific entry several years later in 1808. And this is a man named John Schenck who's paying the blacksmith to strap a black for a welt, for a beating, to a wagon tire with an extra charge for the 12 nails and the act of putting it on. This actually goes back to medieval times, to a a torture called breaking on the wheel. So in 1808, in Oyster Bay, this would have been something probably publicly done in a central public area to torture the person and to instill fear in others. This is just one runaway slave ad. I picked this one because it's actually about Oyster Bay, and it's about another member of the Townsend family who's seeking a runaway named Isaac. But the runaway slave ads like this one were incredibly typical in the time of the Revolution in our area. Every edition of the newspaper, which many of you know are now available online digitally, you can see many, many runaway slave ads like this in every edition of the paper. Now, also in that same house where she was being raised were the Townsend family. There are a lot of mistaken ideas about this Townsend family that I tried to clear up in my book. They were not Quakers, which many people believe to be true. Our wonderful town historian, John Hammond, discovered that that was not true, that they were actually Baptists, and they were very wealthy people. They were wealthy shipping merchants and a pretty large family, a family of 8. And this isn't a painting of them. They never had their family portrait made, but this is another typical wealthy family of that era. So of all of these people in this family of 10, we really remember Robert right now in this era. We remember him especially because Morton Pennypacker in the 1920s and 30s brought forth this discovery that the son Robert had actually been the spy called Culper Jr. He had been this key member of George Washington's spy ring during the Revolutionary War. And so he's really the one that everyone remembers today. Now, these were the stories that Raynham Hall Museum typically always told. The story of spies, the story of the Culper Spy Ring and Abraham Woodhull and Caleb Brewster, the story of how the father, Samuel Townsend, had been a leading patriot, and how the British had encamped in Oyster Bay, billeted themselves in the house, and made the building itself their British headquarters in town. And that's a mouthful, right? That's enough to have to talk about. And I'm sure that the museum would have continued to tell those stories forever. But something happened 16 years ago that really changed everything. And it was as simple as a phone call. We were contacted at the museum by Swan Galleries in New York City. They had an item coming up for sale from a Townsend descendant, an item that we did not know about, a Bible. And they said, you know, we think you're going to want to bid on it. And boy, were they right. We did want to bid on it, and Raynham Hall purchased it at that time for $10,000. It wasn't the Bible verses that were important. It was the handwriting on the end papers, handwriting that revealed that slavery had taken place on the site, which was something that we had never really even conceived of. And not just a little slavery. This was a very long list of names and other information. Names that went on, like Jeffrey, Catherine, Lily, Susanna, Harry, Susan, Rachel, Violet, Hannah, another person, a different person named Susanna, Marianne, Jane, and Gabriel. And just looking at this document, I know you're all history buffs like me. You can see a lot of interesting information is also on there. In some cases, the very day they were born and the month and the year. In some cases, only the year. Sometimes when they died and how they died and how they were related to each other. But there's other curious things about this document too, which you'll have to read the book to really get a greater sense of. Can you tell just by looking at this that this was all written at once with one pen by one person? That's not how Bible records typically appear. And there was a second page. This mentioned 4 more individuals, Nancy, Kate, Jim, and Josh. Those 4 people didn't live at the Raynham Hall site, but they were related to enslaved people who did live there. It also firmly stated that these were the slaves of the family of Samuel Townsend of Oyster Bay, Long Island. And they told another really tragic story of 2 enslaved people, Gabriel and Jane. So this was the information that we got 16 years ago. And it was groundbreaking. But it wasn't the end of the story. I did a year-long exhibit at that time to interpret that Bible record, but that led to other research. And over the following 16 years, I found John, William, Jacob, Priscilla, her son Amos, and 2 individuals who were unique, and their records did not have their names. So I call those 2 people the unnamed child and the unnamed man, though the little facts that we do know about them are incredible. But the person who outstripped them all was Elizabeth, whose nickname was Liz. And just a word about this image of her. Of course, she did not sit for a portrait in her lifetime that we know of. And it's unlikely that we'll ever find a true image of her. But for my book's sake and just for my heart's sake, I really wanted an image of Liz. And so I worked with an artist to create this image of her, which I realize is just an artist's interpretation. But it's important to me to have that to really focus on. So by the end of my research, I had uncovered 20 individuals who were enslaved by the Townsends, a family of 10. They enslaved 2 to 1, double the number of people in their family. And so as a consequence, the museum established a room so that visitors can see an interpretation of a slave's quarters. There's no particular information that this room was used for that, but it's connected to a very narrow, small staircase right out of the shot of this photograph that leads down to where the kitchen had been in that house. But we recognize that there's also an attic above, which may well have been used for this purpose. And there's a basement down below, which also might have been used for enslaved people to live in. The Townsends had a lot of land, including 7 big tracts of land outside of the village. And I'm sure those tracts of land where they were cultivating crops and raising livestock had barns and outbuildings that were living quarters for enslaved people as well. And so this becomes an important story about the Revolutionary period, about the founding period of America, and that slavery should not only be a conversation about the Civil War and the South, that everyone on Long Island, in New York, and in the North should reclaim these stories of individuals whose lives took place at that time and who contributed to the founding of America. We need to make space in our story of America for them. And so in that founding story, Samuel Townsend really became a leading patriot figure in Queens County. He joined this New York Provincial Congress in 1775. Now, people who are interested in learning about that early New York Congress should really read that chapter carefully in my book, because Samuel Townsend did not get elected to that Congress through his own town, Oyster Bay. Oyster Bay was majority loyalist, and they did not want to appoint anyone to join that New York Provincial Congress. But he managed to join through a separate back door in Jamaica, Queens. And as part of that body that was meeting for a whole year and a half, he took a solemn oath of secrecy. So Samuel may not have been a spy like his son, but he was sneaking around quite a bit for a year and a half, trying to plan the revolution from the New York side. Now, we declared our independence, of course, on July 4th. And just 1 month later, he found himself interfacing with our greatest general of Long Island, General Nathaniel Woodhull, who was very nearby to the Brooklyn site where the Battle of Brooklyn was about to begin. General Woodhull had a problem. He did not have any men to engage in the battle that was about to start, the Battle of Long Island. So he asked Samuel and another man to take his letter to George Washington. And this letter basically said, I need 2 regiments. That would be 500 soldiers. I badly need these men to be sent to me immediately, or I cannot enter this battle. General Woodhull only had 40 or 50 militiamen, and every time he turned around, it seemed more of them were running away. Now, Samuel Townsend went and delivered this letter. He waited for Washington's reply, which basically said, I'm not sure. I'll try, but I don't know. Another letter goes back and forth, and a third. And finally, George Washington sends Samuel Townsend to audibly tell the general, very bad news. Long Island was being abandoned. There would not be any soldiers sent his way. And George Washington, of course, as you all I'm sure know, managed to get all of his men over to the Manhattan side. Even though he had been outnumbered and outmaneuvered in the Battle of Long Island, he lived to fight another day with his army, but not so for Long Island. General Woodhull was surrounded by members of Delancey's brigade that same day when he got that bad news. And purportedly, they told him to say, "God save the king." Instead, he supposedly said, "God save us all," whereupon he was struck with swords in the head and the shoulder, grievously wounded, and would later die from those injuries. Now, of course, Long Island was completely overtaken then by the British, and everyone who remained was living behind enemy lines. You have to wonder why a patriot family like the Townsends didn't leave. Why didn't they go to Connecticut, Upper New York, New Jersey? Why did they stay behind enemy lines? Well, they did. And, that put Robert Townsend in an interesting place. And it put Samuel Townsend in an interesting place too. Now, Oyster Bay and the Townsends' home were immediately occupied by the British as soon as Delancey's brigade in the fall of '76. But I'm going to skip us ahead to this regiment called the Queen's Rangers. They came to Oyster Bay in the fall of 1778, so they could winter over in our town. And just like the other commanders before him, Colonel John Graves Simcoe, the commander of the Queen's Rangers, made the Townsend house his home and his regimental headquarters. So if you look at this picture of the Townsend's parlor, it was no longer a space where the family could have a visitor over. It was now a space where Simcoe would have his daily officers' meetings. Now, Simcoe was a very interesting individual. If you've seen the show Turn, you might think that he is a terrible villain and maybe even a psychopathic murderer. Indeed, the family said, the Townsend family themselves, that of all of the commanders that billeted in their house, he was the most honorable. In fact, he was a bit of a poet, and he wrote their daughter, Sally, what's considered America's earliest Valentine, a very long, mushy love poem that he gave to her on Valentine's Day. He was also an early abolitionist. He believed slavery was morally wrong, and he really acted on that belief. He petitioned the British Army to allow him to raise and command in battle a regiment of escaped American slaves, but they didn't permit him to do that. He did actually end up fighting alongside a group called the Black Brigade, led by a very interesting person named Colonel Ty, an escaped American slave from New Jersey. He fought with them just a little bit in 1780, and unfortunately, this person, Colonel Ty, was injured and later died from blood poisoning from his injury. Now, after the war, Simcoe went up to Canada. He became the governor of Upper Canada, and they still have Simcoe Day there to thank him for founding Toronto and for beginning the end of abolition by laws he passed against slavery in the 1790s. So when you think about the Civil War and you think about the Underground Railroad, you should really think about Simcoe. Enslaved Americans were going up to Canada looking for freedom because he had started the end of slavery in Canada in the 1790s. Now, turning back the clock a little, we're now in March of his wintering over stay of 1779. And who could this handsome fellow be in the picture? This was his very good friend, Major John Andre, who was being overworked by his boss, Sir Henry Clinton, out in the Hamptons. And he also had an illness that he wanted to recover from. So Andre had gotten permission to come and visit his friend Simcoe and stay in the Townsend home in Oyster Bay. And there's a picture of the room interpreted as the commander's quarters where Andre would have stayed. Now, of course, Liz was there at the time as well. She was around 17 years old. And so she would have had a lot of contact with both Simcoe, this person who believed slavery was wrong, and with Andre, his good friend. Now, to try to get an idea of Liz's personality, we can actually look at letters that Robert himself wrote about Liz. He said that her only fault was being too fond of the British officers. In another letter, he says her only fault was being too fond of company. So that's a very interesting way to describe her. And it lets us know that she had an interesting and vivacious, maybe charismatic personality. Maybe she had a very some sort of attractiveness about her, and that she was not afraid of speaking to them, and that she may have really enjoyed spending time with them and them with her. And I have to wonder if Simcoe might not have shared with her a new British initiative that was just beginning at that time. The British would announce very shortly that they would promise freedom to any enslaved person in America who would escape from their American enslavers and come over to the British side and join the British effort. Now, right about the same time, in the fall of 1778, a man named Abraham Woodhull, living way out here in Setauket, had been recruited to become George Washington's spy under the name Samuel Culper. He was traveling all the way into Manhattan, and he had many informants in Manhattan. In fact, he talks about one particular informant who was his best. He called this person his faithful friend and one of the first characters of the city. This informant was going to help him gather intelligence in New York. He could then take that intelligence out to Setauket. Caleb Brewster, Washington's lieutenant in Fairfield, would bring a boat over, take that information back over to the Connecticut side, and fast horse riders called dragoons would take it to Washington wherever he was. Who could have been that faithful friend? Well, I believe that it was Robert Townsend. He had a store with this partner, Henry Oakman, in Hanover Square in Lower Manhattan, and he was renting a room from Abraham Woodhull's sister, Mary Underhill. And so it would have been pretty easy for Abraham Woodhull to say he was going to visit his sister in the city and then simply walk down the hall, knock on Robert's door, and hear all the information that Robert, the son of this big patriot, had gathered. Now, we've come to May of 1779. The Queen's Rangers are leaving Oyster Bay. They've been there for 6 months. They're going to take a trip up the Hudson to the Battle of Stony and Verplank's Point. But they weren't leaving empty-handed. Liss had escaped with them. We don't know exactly how she escaped, but I do know that when the Queen's Rangers left Oyster Bay, they had 3 wagons with them. And I found that Simcoe had purchased from Samuel Townsend in the days before they left 2 large H hinges, which are like door hinges, and a quantity of nails. So in my mind's eye, I like to think that he made some sort of a trap door perhaps, or a hiding place, maybe in one of those wagons. Now, we have an amazing document that can let us know a little bit about that escape, written by the spy, Robert Townsend, to his father, Samuel Townsend, just 8 days after her escape. It's such a phenomenal letter, and believe it or not, for decades it was misinterpreted about being a letter about how the British had stolen a cow. It wasn't about a cow. The first part of the letter is just about business, about some goods and the price of things. But down here, Robert begins by writing, the Queen's Rangers are now beyond Kingsbridge. Kingsbridge was a physical bridge, a toll bridge at the top of Manhattan. He says, when I see any of the officers, we'll make inquiry for Liss. And now he advised his father not to chase after her. He says, I think there is no probability of your getting her again. Believe you should reckon her amongst your other dead losses. And then he pins the blame right on Simcoe. He says, I'm surprised that Colonel Simcoe would permit her to go. He certainly must have known it when they left Oyster Bay. Now, why wasn't Robert saying this? Father, I have placed the runaway slave ad in the paper as you requested. I have described the clothing Liss had on when she left. And I've posted the reward for people should they recapture her for you. That was the typical thing to do when a slave escaped. So he's also saying to his father that he knows where she is. The Queen's Rangers are now beyond Kingsbridge. That's quite a distance from Lower Manhattan. I also know that the Queen's Rangers were sneaking up there. This was a silent movement that the Americans weren't supposed to know about. They were silently gathering these different regiments to attack Stony and Verplank's Point. So it's a very interesting letter that I've thought a lot about. Now, Liss did not stay with the Queen's Rangers. In fact, they came back to Oyster Bay for their second stay at the Townsend house just 3 months later. We find out from letters that Robert wrote later that she was re-enslaved in New York City by a British officer who he never names. He keeps the name of that person a secret, even though he tells everybody else's name in her story. So who re-enslaved Liz in New York City? I hope someday to find out that mystery. And of course, Robert became the lead spy right at that time. By June of 1779, he is now Culper Jr., and Abraham Woodhull in Setauket is Culper Sr. I just love this excerpt. I couldn't help but put it in the presentation. If you look on the left, you'll see this code that Benjamin Talmadge, our spy master on the American side, had established. He literally took a dictionary and wrote out all the words he was interested in, and then he assigned them each a number so that the Culper spies could write numbers instead of words. They would call that their dictionary. So he writes, I have received your dictionary and will be glad to have the stain as soon as possible. What was the stain? Invisible ink, invented for the Americans by John Jay's brother, Sir James Jay. You had to have one liquid called the stain, and then to make that reappear, you had to have a second liquid called the counterpart. He also says, I will endeavor to find some shorter route to forward my letters because they were going in the wrong direction quite a long way around. And Washington would complain that often their intelligence was old news by the time he received it. Now, right after all this happened, we got a letter from Abraham Woodhull to Washington. He says he thinks by the assistance of a 355 of my acquaintance shall be able to outwit them all. So Liz escapes from the Townsends. She goes into New York City. Robert becomes the lead spy, establishing his own network of informants, and Woodhull talks about a new lady. That's what 355 meant. Who shall be able to outwit them all? We'll never know who 355 is, as much as we all wish we could know. I don't think we'll ever find out, but I would just like to put Liz in the running. I think that an enslaved person would have a way to outwit the British by being, in essence, invisible. Now, remember when Robert told his father that there's no probability of getting her again? It turns out that Robert knew where Liz was. Robert had contact with Liz during the time when he was a spy, when she was living in New York City. He bought her horehound tea on one occasion, and on another occasion bought her a thimble and thread. Now, in 1780, in the fall, Benedict Arnold switched sides. He came into Manhattan after interacting with that same man, Major John Andr. Benedict Arnold got away, came down to Manhattan and became a British general. And John Andr was captured by the Americans, found guilty of being a spy, and hanged to death. And what did Robert have to say about that? He said, I am happy to think that Arnold does not know my name. Now, if you're familiar with Lower Manhattan and the financial district, you might have even visited Hanover Square. It's right near Fraunces Tavern, right at the top of Stone Street. That was where he originally had his store, right in the middle of everything. When Arnold came to town, he rounded up 40 or so suspected spies, many people who Robert knew and worked with. So Robert left town for several months. And when he came back, he reestablished his business, left his business partner, Oakman, way over here, really on the outskirts of town at Peckslip. And that's where he continued his spy activities for the rest of the war. But he wouldn't write any more of those invisible ink letters. No more written letters from Robert. Now he would only give audible reports. So he would meet with Abraham Woodhull and tell him what he knew. Now, the end of the war came, and in 1782, Liz came to Robert with a problem. Her British officer enslaver was leaving, and she didn't want to go with him. She actually asked Robert to repurchase her. And even though Robert had begun to have feelings against slavery, he had hired an Irish maid named Polly Banvard to do his housekeeping. He agreed to help Liz by, in essence, enslaving her and bringing her into his household. And then he wrote his final letter and he hand delivered it to Benjamin Talmadge in Westchester. And he reported that in essence, from his point of view, everything was over and the war was going to end very soon. Now, when Liz came to Robert and started living with him, she was about 3 months pregnant. In February of 1783, she gave birth to a baby. Robert writes about this child, who he describes as mulatto, a mixed race, and says it was a child that she had while with her then master, meaning himself. Now, in the middle of the summer of 1783, Liz and Robert decided, it seems as though Liz did have some agency in this decision, that she would no longer live with him. Her child, Harry, was about 6 months old. She was now going to be enslaved by a recently widowed woman named Anne Sharwin, who they both knew. Perhaps Anne Sharwin needed help and wanted to take on Liz as a slave and was willing to take Harry as well. Robert attempted to make a deal with this woman that she would never leave New York City, that she would let Robert know if she did want to leave so that he could repurchase Liz back and Harry at the same price, 70 pounds. But unfortunately, she got remarried after only a year to this man, Alexander Robertson. There's actually a private school named after him still in Manhattan, the Alexander Robertson School. And this man did something to Liz, which immediately caused what's described of as a derangement and separation in this marriage to Anne. So the marriage to Anne dissolved almost immediately. He retained Liz and baby Harry, who was then 2, and subsequently sold Liz south to Charleston, South Carolina, keeping baby Harry in Manhattan. It's so frightening and scary to think of what that must have been like for Liz. She was sold south and transported on a ship called the Lucretia. This ship was captained by a man who was so notorious and so evil. His name actually was Captain Tinker. It sounds like that's a made-up name, but it was actually truly his name. He was known to anti-slavery groups in New York because he had a habit of kidnapping free Blacks in New York and taking them down to Charleston and selling them back into slavery. The ad that you're seeing on the right-hand side was placed by a man who calls himself Benevolus. That was a pen name for Benjamin Franklin. And he describes how Captain Tinker has returned to New York Harbor. He's trying to warn free Black people that they might be kidnapped too. Now, unfortunately, Liz was still enslaved. She was not a free person who was kidnapped by Captain Tinker. She was an enslaved person who was just resold and just kept down probably in the hold of the Lucretia, along with the Burlington hams and the biscuits in kegs. And just as she was entering Charleston Harbor on the Lucretia, there was a meeting taking place in New York City on the very same day. It was a new society against slavery, the New York Manumission Society, founded by John Jay, with Alexander Hamilton as one of its key members, and even the other spy, Hercules Mulligan, you may have heard of. And one of its first members was also Robert Townsend. The man that she was enslaved by down in Charleston also was well known to history. He had been the instigator of the Boston Massacre of 1770. The image you see on the left is a pretty well-known image of the Boston Massacre scene. And you'll see there's always this man with a club raised in a lot of the depictions of the Boston Massacre. That man's name was Richard Palms. And many years later, he lived in Charleston and just happened to be the man who enslaved her down there. He was well known as a violent person. After the Boston Massacre, he was arrested for beating a deputy, quote, in a passion. And I just shudder to think of the way he might have treated her down there. Richard Palms also served as a bodyguard for John Adams. During the Revolutionary War, John Adams traveled to Paris, and he was going to help Benjamin Franklin negotiate with the French, sort of help. Franklin wasn't interested in that. And Richard Palms was his bodyguard as he traveled and took him personally into Paris with his son. Now, amazingly, when Richard Palms was delivering John Adams to Paris to meet with Benjamin Franklin, Robert Townsend's older brother Solomon was also there. It's an incredible story, and it's really worth reading in the book just for that particular piece of the story. I won't have time to tell you what Solomon Townsend was doing in Paris, meeting with Benjamin Franklin, but Franklin eventually gave him this oath of allegiance to America so that Solomon Townsend could return to America and he could show everyone that he was a true patriot. And so Solomon and Captain Richard Palms may have even brushed up against each other in Franklin's court. They returned to America on different ships in the same convoy. There are many of these incredible moments in the book where figures who are well known in history are passing through her story, and it just seems incredible, but it's all true. Now, Robert did not know that she was there for 2 years. And when he found out, he immediately took baby Harry from Alexander Robertson's house in Manhattan and brought him back to Oyster Bay to his father's home. And then he started writing to people who he knew would be willing to help. The man on the left, Richard Lushington, had gotten some attention in New York for helping one of those kidnapped free Black people by writing to John Jay about this man who had been kidnapped. And so Robert had probably heard about Richard Lushington through the Manumission Society. The man on the right, his name is Adam Gilchrist. He was a good family friend of the Townsends, who the older brother Solomon did business with in Charleston. He had also joined that Manumission Society early on. And ironically, that Manumission Society that Robert had joined had put into law, while List was down in Charleston, a law that prohibited slaves from coming back into New York from another state. And so it was actually illegal to return List to New York and to her son. And so they probably had to smuggle her back in. I did find an amazing record that shows that Elizabeth was likely back in Oyster Bay in 1789. This is the record that John Hammond discovered that showed that the Townsends were Baptists. It's the Baptist Church record of 1789. And here we see Samuel Townsend listed as a member, and across from him, Elizabeth, a Black woman. And here's a secondary page with his wife, Sarah, and his daughter, Sally, as members of that church. And I'm very hopeful that this is my final sight of Elizabeth in the 1790 census. I know that a lot of the people on this call will recognize the name David Richard Floyd Jones. Here is his listing in the 1790 census, the first federal census, and right below his name, someone I really hope is our list, Free Elizabeth, as a single person. Now, this is his home, which stood in what's now Massapequa for many years, Fort Neck House. And if Liz did live in that household and work as a paid servant there, this is where she would have worked. This is the front room of that house where she might have done cleaning or childcare duties. And these are wonderful WPA era photographs of the interior of the house. She might have walked through that arched doorway or climbed those hanging stairs. Whatever happened to Liz as an adult after that time is something that I have not discovered yet. After this book was published, I've still continued to discover a few interesting things. So even though Liz is disappearing from view in this slide, I am always hopeful that someone out there will discover something else about her life after that last time. We do know what happened to slavery in New York. It finally ended in 1827, on July 4th, actually. It had been 201 years of slavery in New York. So when you're celebrating July 4th next year, I really hope you also recognize that as the end of slavery in New York. And so what happens to Liz now? What happens to Liz's story now? I'm beginning a brand new chapter in my life, something I'm so excited to announce for the first time publicly here. I'm going to establish Remember Liz, a not-for-profit organization that will be dedicated to sharing her story with the public. through public programs and curriculum in schools in any way that I can. And so you probably won't hear about that for a few more months, but I'm giving you the inside news that Remember Liz is going to be a new home for her story to be told far and wide. And I want to keep in touch with everyone on this call. So there's two great ways to do that. I have a website and I just have the name of the book. So it's real easy to remember, espionageandenslavement.com. On the website, you can contact me directly through the contact tab. You could order a signed book. Of course, you can also get the book on Amazon or Barnes & Noble. And you can also see an interesting timeline that I will be adding to. It shows you some of the key dates of documents I've discovered about Liz's life. Everybody's on Facebook, right? And so is Liz at Espionage and Enslavement in the Revolution on Facebook. That's another way you can keep in touch with me. And sometimes I'm just sharing posts about this day in her life or something I've discovered or about a talk I might be giving somewhere. So please keep in touch. And then we're coming to my favorite part, the Q&A, because I want to hear what you have to say and what you think of this new founding figure, this new person whose life we can use to understand the founding of America through the eyes of a woman of color. So let me just stop sharing so that people can start sharing.
Thank you, Claire. Wonderful story, wonderful research that you have done to uncover so much information on Liz, and it's not easy, I know, to trace enslaved people, but you've done a wonderful job. People should put questions in the Q&A, but I'll start off. The foreword to your book is by the well-known singer and actress Vanessa Williams. Do you want to say how that happened?
Yes, and I want to also acknowledge that I'm the co-author of this book. My other co-author is an amazing professional writer named Tiffany Yecke Brooks, and her writing ability was key and so important to me. She's a fantastic partner, as is Vanessa Williams. Vanessa Williams is actually part of this history. She has roots in Oyster Bay and ancestry that leads back to the era of slavery. She's got a really strong connection to David Carl, who was a soldier in a colored unit in the Civil War, whose grave is in the AME Zion Graveyard, a historic cemetery in Pine Hollow in Oyster Bay. And the Carl home is still existing in Pine Hollow. But as you'll read in the book, Pine Hollow went back much earlier than that, all the way back to the first slave freed anywhere on Long Island that we have a record of, Tom Gall, whose original African name was Awa. So Vanessa Williams has been an incredible help in writing the foreword and in bringing out this story to the public. So a lot of people say that should be a movie. And I say, yes.
I wanted to mention, in case anyone didn't know, you said that Samuel had representing Queens County, and of course, Nassau County did not exist until 1899. So it was part of Queens County at that time.
Yeah, it was all Queens County until you got out to Suffolk. Yep. And
the Raynham Hall has a new education center, and there are 2 dioramas there. It's very neat. That exhibit, one diorama of the Battle of Long Island, and another of when the, I guess, Queens Rangers left Oyster Bay. Am I correct? It's depicting the year they were there and the day they left when Liz escaped. But what it really gives people a view of is, what did the village look like in that year? And so there's a whole lot of residential streets and houses that aren't there, of course, but there's also a British fort. There was a fort in Oyster Bay within sight of that house, and it was built by Colonel John Graves Simcoe. He started building it the day after they arrived in November of 1778. And so Richard Schuster is an amazing artist who professionally makes dioramas. And he had made the diorama of the Battle of Long Island originally for the New York Historical Society. And so the collaboration with him has been really amazing. He's a fantastic friend and just a great historian. And you've got more there than those dioramas as well, an interactive screen there and artifacts on exhibit and some of the materials that you uncovered, certainly. It's true. We have one question. Any ideas how Liz ended up with the Joneses?
Yes, this is so complicated, but I love talking about it. So the Joneses, right? Jones Beach, thousands of acres. But the Joneses were on the loyalist side. And so Judge Thomas Jones was the loyalist Jones during the Revolutionary War who was on the wrong side of history, wasn't he? And he got kicked out of the country. He got attainted. To be attainted meant to be declared legally dead. And you would have all of your goods seized by the American government. And all of that thousands of acres of land and that mansion might have been sold off for money. But there was one man who could legally inherit it. And he was the son of Arabella Jones, David Richard Floyd. Now, you might remember the Floyds. William Floyd was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. And you can go out and see Floyd Manor and understand what patriots the Floyds were. And so if he was going to change his name to Floyd Jones legally through an act of the legislature, he was going to inherit all that land. And that happened with the help of Samuel Townsend in the last year of his life, 1790. They passed the law that allowed David Richard Floyd to become David Richard Floyd Jones. And so the Joneses had another interesting part in Samuel Townsend's life. Back in the 1750s, he had gotten in a lot of trouble for standing up for the rights of a group called the French Neutrals. These were people who had been thrown out of Canada and scattered across the 13 colonies and had all their rights and possessions taken away from them. And municipalities like Oyster Bay were given several French neutrals that they had to administer the care of at the expense of the public. And so people were supposed to get compensated for housing and feeding these French neutrals. Well, Samuel Townsend was a justice at that time, and he thought that people were being mistreated. They weren't being paid for helping the French neutrals, and the French neutrals were being discriminated against. So he wrote a very strong letter to David Jones, who was the Speaker of the General Assembly of New York in the 1750s. And David Jones promptly imprisoned Samuel Townsend. There was no freedom of speech back then. For writing that letter, he got thrown in prison. So he had a bone to pick with those Joneses, and it looked like he finally got to pick that bone in the final year of his life. It's a complicated story, the Joneses and the Floyds, but it's a real interesting one.
I think the William Floyd House may be closed. Well, it's closed. It's off season now, so it's closed, but I think they're doing some renovations there. But hopefully we can get back to see that one of these days.
Yeah, that's an incredible space.
The interesting thing at the Floyd estate is they show it as it evolved with the family rather than stuck in one particular time period. So you start in the colonial period and end up in a 1930s kitchen.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Incredible. Mary's comment, so glad to be hearing the story and how it is still evolving. Such an important time in our world, national, state, and local history, and so important that we learn it and share it. Thanks so much. Fascinating.
Oh, thank you so much. You know, I really feel like just right now is the perfect time for this story to come out, because so many people are struggling with this idea of how can we talk about the founding of America in 1776 and the enslavement of African Americans, and that those two things have to be a choice. But with this story, they're really wedded together beautifully, and you can really see so clearly how it's one story of America. It isn't two. It's really just one unified story. You know,
I assume you finished the book more than a year ago. Is there anything you've discovered since you finished writing?
It's so amazing because it did come out in May, but even when it was going to press, the week it was going to press, we found one more thing. And that was the thing that I discovered about Nathan Hale that was written about in Newsday, about the logbook of the Halifax. So look up that Newsday article if you want to read about that. But what did I just find out last week? Oh, just last week. I was contacted by an archivist down in South Carolina at the archives in Columbia, South Carolina. He had a book that actually, some people call it a pamphlet because it doesn't have a hardcover. It was from 1787, and it's written by a man named Thomas Clarkson, and it's about the evils of the African slave trade. So it's an early anti-slavery book. And it had on its cover, handwritten, the name Samuel Townsend.
Wow.
So this researcher contacted me. He said, is it at all possible this could be your Samuel Townsend? And I was skeptical. I had been down at the archives in Columbia researching lists and had found things in their archive relating to her. But I thought, no, this couldn't be, right? So he sent me an image of it. It was him. I found the word Townsend in Samuel Townsend's handwriting, the abbreviated word Samuel, and the full name Samuel, because all three appear on the page, and they were all exact. It was his handwriting. So then I had to think, well, how in the world did Samuel Townsend, who had 12 enslaved people in his estate when he died, how did he come to own this anti-slavery book? Well, I figured it out, I think, Natalie. I went into the Manumission Society minutes, which are all digitized. And at their May meeting, May 17th of 1787, they say that they've received the pamphlets by Thomas Clarkson and have distributed them to their membership. Then I found a newspaper article about the meeting, and it showed all the members who had been there, and Robert Townsend is listed. So Robert Townsend attended that meeting. He was given a copy of that book, and I guess he gave it to his dad.
Another wonderful piece of research.
I would definitely put that in the book because May is exactly when I estimate Liz returned from Charleston. And where did she go? Samuel Townsend's house. She was going to now be living there. And then an act against slavery was something, or an act maybe about slavery, was something that was passed by the New York State Legislature the following year, 1788. And so Samuel Townsend was in the Senate at that time, and he was part of that discussion of that act. I think it's called the Act Concerning Slavery of 1788. And it's just amazing to see those new things come to light.
Gary asks, what are the access hours at Raynham Hall? And that would include the education center. Yeah.
Well, their scheduling has changed of late. As I understand it, now every other day, so Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday, if you go to Raynham Hall, starting at 1:00 p.m., you'll be asked to download an app onto your phone. And that app, when you hold it up, will show you like a little sort of a cartoon person inside the app. And those little cartoon people will tell you history as developed by this company. So if that's what you're interested in, then you should go on those days. If you want to talk to a docent and see the historic house that way, you should go on Wednesday, Friday, or Sunday. And in those days, the tours are at 1 p.m. and 3 p.m. But yeah, that's when you would go. Yeah.
And that's West Main Street in Oyster Bay, right?
Yes. And the house itself is 20 West Main, but where you would enter, where the new exhibit is 30. It's right next door. You can't miss it.
Right. And
if you want to contact me, you should definitely reach out to me on my website through the contact tab or on Facebook.
And Nancy says, thank you for this fascinating story. This is what we need to learn. I look forward to hearing and reading more about it. Read the book. And
yeah,
you can get a signed copy again from the website, which is the title of the book, Espionage and Enslavement. And
yeah, go to the shop tab on that website if you want the signed copy. There's, the tabs up at the top say shop. There's only one thing to buy, and it's a signed book.
Right. Okay, anyone else? Yeah, questions? Where did you find most of the sources for your book? The letters and other things. Obviously, some was in that Bible that they purchased. But
the Bible is just the beginning. Really, the Townsend family papers are split into 3 parts, which is strange but true. Raynham Hall's archives owns about 1/3. A good chunk of them are out at the East Hampton Free Library. Morton Pennypacker took them out there. And then about 1/3 of some really amazing stuff is at the New York Historical Society in their archives. But I also found things down in Charleston, South Carolina, and Columbia, South Carolina. Found things out in Ann Arbor, Michigan at the Clements Library, up in Ontario, Canada, the Simcoe family papers, and even at Mystic Seaport, they had a really interesting couple of documents. And then also, there's just a body of information in old newspapers, especially when you're dealing with merchants, the way this story really is dealing with a lot of merchants. There's so much in the newspaper, and now they're all digitized. So you have to belong to services a lot of the times to get the good access. But for me, it was well worth the expense because I can just flip through those old papers and feel like I'm getting to know these folks, you know?
As you got to know Liz and the Townsends
Yeah.
over the last 16, 17 years.
Yep. I actually moved to Lower Manhattan during COVID so that I can live right down in the neighborhood where they lived. And I'm even working on a walking tour because I can walk around Lower Manhattan and know where some of these sites actually were. It's incredible. And so that's just some of the things that I'm going to be working on with Remember Liz.
A walking tour for the Culper Spy Ring and Liz, or
Not
what?
just the Culper Spy Ring, but also Espionage and Enslavement. Yeah.
Right.
A lot of people don't think about the Culper Spy Ring as being a Manhattan story, but it really is. Manhattan was British headquarters. Setauket was part of the spy ring only because it was so far away from Manhattan, so far out of the eyes of the British. But all the action was happening down in Lower Manhattan.
And what's your take on the name now escapes me, the
Turn?
publisher, you want to say something about Turn. Yes.
Turn?
Yeah. For
It's
those who
just-
saw it on AMC a few years ago, a series on.
It's still on Netflix, yeah. You know, it's good in a lot of ways because it got people interested in the Revolutionary War and in the spy ring, but it's so inaccurate. It's just amazing how inaccurate it is. It portrays the Townsends as Quakers. It portrays Simcoe as quartering out in Setauket, which he never did. It doesn't show Simcoe quartering in Robert Townsend's childhood home. I mean, that's a big miss for them. It also says that Robert owned a tavern, which he never did. It says he was a partner with James Rivington, the newspaper man. Nope, never was. And that Rivington was also a spy. A lot of people contend that's true, but I see no evidence of that. I see evidence to the contrary, actually. And it also puts forth this legend, this untrue legend of this woman, Anna Strong, who purportedly hung her petticoats on the clothesline as a code to the spies. And it's a great sounding story, but sorry, just no evidence to show that that's true at all. So Turn's just got a whole bunch of problems, not to mention just portraying Simcoe as such a villain when he really was not. So
What about Rivington? Do you think whose side was he on? The public.
You know, Rivington is an interesting person. He struggled to keep his newspaper alive as the war progressed. He was definitely attacked by both sides. And it would be a great idea to have a spy own a newspaper, but there's no proof to say that he did. His name appears in the Culper Spy Code, Rivington, not James Rivington, just Rivington with a number. But here's the interesting thing. They used to put the Gazette in with their spy papers when they would get Robert's letters and Abraham Woodhull's letters together in a package to send to Washington. They would put the paper in there too, because Rivington's paper was announcing the news from the British perspective. It had a lot of great intelligence in it. And so it's possible that that's why that's in the code, meaning the paper. Robert actually says in one of his Culper Spy letters to Washington to be careful about Rivington because it seems like he's exposed their spy ring. And if you look in that edition of Rivington's Gazette, he says there are spies in New York and we're going to rout them out. So how can that be his partner if he's tattling about them in the paper? Doesn't seem plausible to me.
No, not at all. So
yeah, I've whittled down the supposed 6 down to it's really Culper Sr. and Culper Jr., they're couriers, Caleb Brewster and Talmadge and Washington.
That's it.
Those are the folks. Yeah.
Okay. And Bill Blier's book on the Culper Spy Ring.
Oh, fantastic. Everybody has
wonderful.
to get that one too.
Yes.
Really great.
So we thank you, Claire, for your enthralling presentation.
Thank you.
And I remind people her website, www.espionageandenslavement.com.
Yep.
And you can find the book that's the name of the book also.
Yep.
And for those attending, after you log off, there will be a one question survey will come up, and your response is anonymous, but the feedback is important to us. So I thank you all for coming. We look forward to seeing you at our Louis Armstrong program in February. I hope that will be in person in East Williston. Tentative date, Sunday, February 5th. Check our website for more details when they're available. So again, many thanks to Claire and to everyone who attended.
Thank you. And if any of the folks that are listening today belong to another historic group or a book club or any sort of gathering of folks, and you would like for me to come and talk about lists, that's what I like to do. So please reach out.
So wonderful. Thank you. Okay. Bye now.
Bye-bye.